Nathaniel Hayes didn't believe in chaos. He believed in numbers, in perfectly calculated financial strategies, in decisions that left no room for emotion. At 34, he had built Hayes Capital into one of New York's top investment firms. The towering glass buildings of his company stood as symbols of power and absolute control, the foundation of everything he had built. But behind the polished image of a successful businessman, Nathaniel carried a secret, a truth that, if exposed, would send shockwaves through the financial world. He had never truly loved anyone, not because he lacked opportunities, but because he had never allowed himself to lose control. Since childhood, his father, Richard Hayes, a legend in the investment world, had drilled one lesson into him. Emotions are weaknesses, and the most successful people are those who eliminate distractions from their lives. And so, for over 3 decades, Nathaniel had followed that rule, never letting anyone get too close, never loving too deeply, always putting his career first. But then, Elle Sinclair walked into his life, and in just a single moment, the world he had meticulously built began to crack. Nathaniel had always considered his office an impenetrable fortress. Everything was arranged to perfection, from the sleek ebony desk to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. No clutter, no surprises. But then, Elle Sinclair walked in and brought a storm with her. The door opened, and in an instant, Nathaniel knew she was unlike anyone he had ever met before. Elle wore a perfectly tailored navy ghoul suit, yet there was something entirely untamed about her presence. Her natural curls framed her face, and her deep brown eyes held something he couldn't quite decipher. In his world, people calculated every move, but Elle walked in as if she had belonged here all along. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice smooth, warm, and utterly self-assured. "Thank you for this opportunity." Nathaniel hesitated, a second too long. He wasn't used to being caught off guard. "Have a seat," he said, his tone as steady as ever. Elle sat down, placing a leather-bound notebook on the desk. A notebook, in an office where everything was digital, it made her seem both outdated and strangely out of place. "I've reviewed your file," Nathaniel continued, glancing at his iPad. "Harvard graduate, top of your class, 4 years at one of London's leading investment firms. Why leave all that to come here?" Elle tilted her head slightly, a hint of a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Sometimes the most interesting opportunities aren't in the most obvious places, Mr. Hayes." For the first time in a long time, Nathaniel felt challenged, and he didn't like it. "I run Hayes Capital with absolute precision," he said, studying her carefully. "Everything, including people, has a place and a purpose." Elle held his gaze, something almost playful flickering in her eyes. "And what about people, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, voice calm yet laced with quiet defiance. "Do they fit neatly into your precision too?" Nathaniel felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. She made him want to loosen his tie. The interview continued, but something in the air had shifted, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel Hayes had the unsettling feeling that he was no longer entirely in control. 2 weeks of working with Elle, and Nathaniel understood one thing: she could not be controlled. She wasn't like his previous assistants, those who followed orders without question. Elle didn't just excel at her job, she occupied his mind in a way he couldn't explain. Every morning, when he walked into the office at exactly 7:30, she was already there, coffee on the desk, schedule in hand. And every morning, when she handed him the iPad, their fingers would brush for the briefest second, but long enough to make time slow. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." "Miss Sinclair," he replied, voice steady, but something unreadable flickered in his gaze. Nathaniel told himself it was just biology, but the truth was, he found himself watching her more than necessary. He noticed the way she bit her lip when concentrating, the way her fingers glided over the screen when flipping through reports. And worse, he wanted to feel her skin for more than just a fleeting second. But Nathaniel Hayes wasn't a man who let emotions dictate his actions. At least he had believed that, until their trip to Chicago. A sudden snowstorm grounded all flights back to New York, forcing them to stay the night at a hotel. Nathaniel booked separate rooms, but as they stood in the elevator together, close enough that he could feel her warmth, he realized he was fighting a losing battle. Inside the hotel room, Nathaniel sat in the chair, a glass of scotch in hand, staring out at the snowfall blanketing the city, but his mind was anything but calm. A knock on the door. When he opened it, Elle stood there, still in her business attire, but her hair was slightly undone, and uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "We need to talk," she said, voice low. Nathaniel stepped aside, letting her in. She folded her arms, meeting his gaze head on. "Mr. Hayes, I'm not blind." He raised an eyebrow. "I don't know what you mean." "Really?" She took a step closer. "Then look me in the eye and tell me there's nothing between us except work." The air in the room thickened. Nathaniel's grip on his glass tightened. "Well, I can't." "Why?" she whispered. He inhaled sharply, as if waging war within himself. "Because if I start, I won't be able to stop." The confession hung between them, heavy with temptation. Elle looked at him, understanding in her eyes. "Then don't stop," she whispered. And in that moment, the walls Nathaniel had built for 34 years came crashing down. His hand cupped her face, fingers tracing along her soft skin. Her breath was warm against his lips, and then he kissed her. No calculations, no control, just complete surrender. And Nathaniel knew there was no turning back. That night, Nathaniel broke every rule he had ever set for himself. His kiss was no longer just an explosion of suppressed emotions. It was complete surrender to something he had been fighting for far too long. Elle kissed him back, soft yet hungry. There were no more boundaries, no more lines between boss and assistant, logic and emotion. There was only them, discovering something real. Nathaniel pulled her closer, feeling her warmth, the scent of her hair, the rhythm of her heartbeat matching his. He lifted her into his arms, carrying her toward the bed, never once breaking eye contact. "Elle." His voice was husky, almost a confession. She simply smiled, tracing her fingers along his jaw. "Don't stop?" And he didn't. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains, casting a golden glow over the hotel room. Nathaniel woke to warmth beside him. Elle lay in his arms, her curls fanned across the pillow, her breathing soft and even. He let out a slow breath, feeling something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Peace. For years, he had lived by rigid rules, never once letting anyone get this close. But now, watching Elle sleep so soundly in his arms, he wondered, had he been wrong all along? This wasn't just a night. This was the beginning of something more, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of it. Nathaniel had never woken up next to a woman and felt at peace. He didn't want to move, didn't want to leave. Elle stirred slightly, her deep brown eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, she smiled, a smile that lit up his entire world. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," she teased, her voice still laced with sleep. Nathaniel smiled, a real smile, not the composed one he wore in boardrooms. "Call me Nathaniel." Elle tilted her head, studying him with playful curiosity. "And what does that mean?" Nathaniel brushed a strand of hair from her face. "It means you're not just my assistant anymore. You're mine." Elle let out a soft laugh. "You should have said that a long time ago." Nathaniel leaned in, pressing a lingering kiss to her lips. From that moment on, they belonged to each other. Their love story wasn't perfect, but it was real. Back in New York, they started spending more time together, openly. Nathaniel no longer hid his emotions. They had late-night dates after work, where he took Elle to cozy little restaurants instead of the high-end places frequented by New York's elite. They had lazy Sunday mornings, where Elle dragged Nathaniel out of bed to cook breakfast with her instead of diving straight into work. They had small but meaningful moments, like when Nathaniel laced his fingers through hers while walking down a crowded street, or when Elle rested her head on his shoulder at the movies. And most importantly, Nathaniel learned how to love without control. He no longer tried to define love or fit it into a neat equation. He simply loved her, day by day, moment by moment. And with Elle, he wasn't the cold CEO of Hayes Capital. He was just a man in love with a woman, truly, deeply, and without regret. Nathaniel had always believed his life was a perfect equation. every variable controlled, every decision calculated. But ever since that night in Chicago, every rule he had set for himself had begun to unravel. Elle was no longer just his assistant. She was the only woman he wanted, though he hadn't yet found the courage to say it out loud. Every moment with her, a glance, a touch, a stolen smile, made his world shift in ways he no longer wanted to resist. But he wasn't the only one who had noticed the change. One morning, as Nathaniel stepped into his office, he found his father, Richard Hayes, already seated in the chair opposite his desk. "Good morning, son," Richard greeted, his voice smooth but his eyes sharp. Nathaniel adjusted his tie, sensing the tension in the air. "You're here early. What's this about?" Richard crossed his arms, his gaze drifting toward the glass walls where Elle sat working just outside. "We need to talk about Eleanor Sinclair." The air in the room froze. "She's an excellent employee," Nathaniel said evenly. "She's not the problem," Richard cut in. "You are." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Since when do you let emotions cloud your judgment?" Richard continued, his voice calm but weighted. "Since when did you forget that men like us don't get to choose love?" Nathaniel clenched his fists beneath the desk. "So this isn't a conversation, it's a command. You are the heir to Hayes Capital, Nathaniel. Every decision you make reflects on this family. She is not suitable. No pedigree, no connections, and certainly not someone who can stand by your side as your wife." Nathaniel felt his blood boil. "She is not some investment portfolio for you to assess." Richard leaned forward, his voice growing sharper. "If you continue down this path, you will lose everything." The weight of those words hit harder than anything Nathaniel had ever heard from his father. "You have another option," Richard went on. "The Langfords have agreed. Victoria Langford is the right choice. Wealthy, well-educated, from the right circles. A marriage between our families will solidify Hayes Capital's future." Nathaniel let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it, only resentment and disgust. "So my entire life is just another business deal to you?" "No, Nathaniel," Richard said, standing, his voice like steel. "You are the one who will uphold this family's legacy. But only if you don't let yourself be swayed by a woman who doesn't belong." And just like that, Richard walked out, leaving Nathaniel alone with a choice he could no longer avoid. The question was he willing to betray his own heart just to please his father? Nathaniel had once believed that he would never have to choose between love and his career. But as he stared at his own reflection in the office window, he realized he had changed. He was no longer just a man who lived for numbers and power. He wanted more. He wanted Elle. But choosing her meant going against his family, his legacy, and the future his father had meticulously planned for him. Nathaniel Hayes was not a man who easily backed down, but when his opponent was the man who had controlled his entire life, the choice became harder than ever. The next day, Nathaniel walked into the office with a decision already made. He found Elle in the firm's private library, organizing a stack of files. When she looked up, he saw the guarded expression in her eyes. "We need to talk," he said, his voice steady. Elle slowly set the file down. "I don't think there's anything left to say, Nathaniel. My father wants me to marry Victoria Langford." She took a deep breath, nodding as if she had expected it. "Then you should," she said firmly, though her eyes told a different story. "Pain." "No." She froze. "I don't care about Victoria, about status, or about what my family expects anymore. The only thing I care about is you." His hand reached for hers, but she stepped back. "Nathaniel, don't do this." "Why not?" His gaze locked onto hers. "Why can't I choose you over them?" "Because I don't want to be the choice you make, only when everything else falls apart." Her words hit him harder than any blow his father had ever dealt. "Oh, Nathaniel, you've spent your entire life doing what others expect of you. But have you ever actually asked yourself what you want?" He held his breath. This was the moment. He could go back, be Richard Hayes' obedient son, marry Victoria, and secure his family's legacy. Or he could stand up and fight for himself, for his love. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he had to do. He looked at her, no hesitation in his eyes. "I want you, Elle, not in secret, not as a mistake. I want you by my side, out in the open, no matter what." His hand reached for hers again, and this time, Elle didn't pull away. She searched his face, her eyes shimmering but resolute. "If you do this, you'll lose everything." He leaned in closer, his voice unwavering. "No, you are everything." And then he kissed her, without fear, without hesitation. And with that kiss, Nathaniel Hayes finally chose his own path. And Nathaniel Hayes once had everything: power, status, respect. But at what cost? A life without freedom. But now, as he stood before his father in the Hayes Capital boardroom, he was no longer the man who bowed to expectation. "I refuse," Nathaniel said, his voice unwavering. Richard Hayes raised an eyebrow, a cold smirk playing at his lips. "Do you even understand what you're saying?" "More than ever. I won't marry Victoria, and I will never let this family dictate my life again." Silence settled over the room. The board members watched, waiting for the reaction of one of the most powerful men in New York. "If you walk away from this, you are no longer the heir to Hayes Capital," Richard said, each word sharp as a blade. Nathaniel let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. His entire life he had fought to earn his father's approval, only to realize now it had never been his to win. "You're right about one thing, Father," he said, voice low but steady. "I'm not the right heir for Hayes Capital, because I refuse to be just another pawn in your game." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You are making a mistake." Nathaniel met his father's gaze without flinching. "No. For the first time in my life, I'm making my own choice." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Richard said nothing. For the first time, he saw his son not as a boy, but as a man who had made his choice. Nathaniel turned and walked out of the boardroom without looking back, because he already had everything he needed. The sun dipped below the horizon as Nathaniel stepped into their San Francisco apartment. Elle stood by the window, gazing at the ocean. When she turned to him, a small smile played on her lips. "You're home?" "I'm home," he echoed, stepping closer and wrapping his arms around her. The past year hadn't been easy. Nathaniel had built a new company from the ground up. Elle had pursued her own career, not as an assistant, but as his equal, his partner in every decision. And most importantly, they had done it together. "I have a question," Nathaniel murmured, reaching into his pocket. Elle's eyes widened. "Nathaniel." He opened the small box, a sapphire ring, deep blue like his own eyes. Nathaniel took a slow breath, holding Elle's hands between his own. "Elle, I spent my whole life thinking love was a distraction, something that made men weak, but you proved me wrong." Elle's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You walked into my life and turned it upside down," Nathaniel continued, his voice thick with emotion. "And for the first time, I don't want control, I just want you. I don't care where we go, what we do, as long as I have you by my side." He opened the small box, revealing the sapphire ring. "So, Elle Sinclair, will you build this life with me?" Tears slipped down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Nathaniel smiled, sliding the ring onto her finger before pulling her into a deep kiss. Outside, waves crashed against the shore, the sea breeze tangling through their hair. They had sacrificed so much to get here, but sometimes love is worth every risk.